Fans, I think all of us, rather anticipated the death of the big Bambino. It's been coming on for a long, long while. About a year ago, I think it was August the 3rd, if I'm not mistaken, Babe was here in Cincinnati for that American Legion game that they played out here at Cincinnati last year. And I had the pleasure of spending a day with the Babe. And at that time, he looked particularly sick and ailing, which he was, of course. And I didn't expect him really to live until Christmas. But Ruth has tremendous stamina, and did have tremendous stamina, and he just fought off the disease for practically a solid year. I don't think it may have been that an ordinary human being would have lived a year under the same conditions, but I doubt it. Now, Ruth was always like that, a fellow of tremendous capacity for tremendous things, and he filled the capacities to the limit. A lot of people might think that, I hope that you don't misunderstand me whatsoever in talking about Ruth. I am very saddened by the big fellow's death. I naturally have sat here all night broadcasting to you with my mind half on Ruth and my mind half on the ball game. And it leaves not a void in my life. I won't say that because I don't get to see the Babe much anymore. And so naturally it wouldn't be as if your best friend died, but after you play with a fellow for a great many years, and the fellow has been a very vital factor in anything that you might have undertaken in your life, why, naturally, you become very close to a fellow like that. Ruth was very close to all the ball players who ever played with him on the New York Yankees, and all of us, well, he was the baseball player's hero. He was my hero. He was the fellow who, in past years, right after the Black Sox scandal, rebuilt baseball when the customers were frowned upon it. Then later on, he came into his own as a famous home run hitter. Naturally, he was in the early 20s, he was a famous home run hitter. But he got, as I always am pleased to say, he was the fellow most responsible for the rise in baseball players' salaries. He created new standards of economics, the new economic standards in baseball. He raised the salaries. He also brought more attention to baseball. He I believe, put baseball on a higher plane than it ever had been before the era of Ruth. I am not a moralist. I don't pretend that Ruth was a holier-than-thou sort of an individual because some of his escapades off the field would not bear telling on this radio. They wouldn't bear telling in some living rooms, I suppose. The Babe always reminded me of a fellow who, just took his fun where he found it, and it wasn't through premeditation as much as it was perhaps through ignorance, let's say, of moral standards. Let's put it that way. He did what he thought was just and right, and some of the things that he thought were just and right were not just exactly what other people would consider along the same lines. That is why tonight, although I feel Babe Ruth's death very keenly, it really made me nervous around the 8th inning when I knew I had to talk to you about Babe, and I started to perspire up here at the broadcasting table a little bit, and the back of my legs were a little bit weak, because I can't tell you in 15 minutes, fans, I can't tell you the number of things that I know, the full life story of the big guy, because so much happened in those years, those 10 years that I spent with him. Actually, more than 10 years. I was with him a year and a half on the Boston Red Sox, and so much happened in that time that all those things came back in a rush to me all at one time, and I was not entirely capable of comprehending the fact that the big fellow is dead. The implications there are tremendous, and I know the flood of publicity will come out now as life story, and I read an article not long ago. I read a piece in the paper here in one of the Cincinnati papers written by one of the syndicated story that had more discrepancies in it than I have ever seen in one story regarding Ruth. It was evidently a piece dashed off in a hurry to beat the gun by somebody that wanted to get something in about Ruth. It wasn't a local writer at all. It wasn't Nick Denton, if you're thinking of that. Nick Denton, I thought, wrote a beautiful piece about Babe the other night in the Time-Star. Now, I know that's an opposition paper to the Cincinnati Post here, whom this station in Cincinnati represents and whom I work for most directly. But nevertheless, nevertheless, credit where credit is due. I thought Nick Denton wrote a beautiful piece about Babe the other evening, and Denton hit the nail on the head, because he said what I would have said all along, and that is that Babe led a mighty full life. Babe died this evening, yes, but died, I think, as we would talk if I met you on a street corner, or if you'll be a little intimate with me and not feel that you are hearing a prepared, paid-for show, because this is not. I am telling you my private, personal thoughts. I am talking to you just as if, wherever you are, I was standing next to you or sitting next to you or sitting across the room talking to you about Babe Ruth, and I would like you, as an understanding and broad-minded person, to know that Babe did everything there was to do, I think, in life. He was not cheated. He led a mighty full life. There wasn't anything that I think that, anything that you would want, or anything that he would want that wasn't fulfilled. And so the fellow died not wanting. There was only one thing that Ruth was disappointed in. That was the fact that he was never given a chance to manage a Major League Baseball team. That was his biggest disappointment. I know that because he's told me that. And he did hold a resentment toward the game that he practically saved before they never gave him a chance. My opinion on that was merely that they should have given him a chance at some point or other. He may have failed because he had extreme ideas. He may not have been a good handler of baseball men. There may have been some weaknesses in his system somewhere, and he may have failed. But nevertheless, then baseball would have been able to say at least, well, we did give the fellow his chance, and Ruth would have been satisfied to have had that chance. But you know, a very peculiar thing. It strikes me, as I sit here talking to you, that there were two fellows on that New York club, Ruth and Gehrig, who seem to have been designed by the great maker and the great decider to have fulfilled a mission in this great game of baseball, and Gehrig and Ruth. It's strange that two fellows batting one right after the other in the batting order of the New York Yankees of 1927, considered, and I'm speaking factually now, not through pride or not through my own emotions so much, I'm speaking to you factually, considered by many the greatest baseball team to ever step on a baseball field. Think of the fact, fans, that two fellows who batted one right after the other, and they alternated at times. There was sometimes Ruth batted fourth and sometimes Gehrig batted fourth, but two fellows that died the way they died, suffering for over a year, and two of the greatest sluggers and home run hitters that you have ever seen in shoe leather. And to think that those two fellows passed away, Gehrig suffering the way he did in his latter years from infantile paralysis, and then Ruth suffering from cancer and dying the way he did. And yet they seem to have had missions in life. Gehrig seemed to carry the mission of sort of the American boy, a very different type fellow than Babe Ruth, very as far apart as the two poles. Gehrig was the type of fellow who was more domesticated, thoroughly a fellow attached to his parents and his mother, and a fellow who lived a very quiet and conservative life. Ruth was more the John L. Sullivan type of fellow, robust and around and out and loud and here and there, and the world was Ruth's oyster, and he devoured his oysters as, boy, he could eat barrels of them, if you're putting it in allegorical terms. And he was certainly a different type than Gehrig. And yet it seems that Ruth had his following, Gehrig had his following, and Gehrig came into baseball as a kid that came up from nowhere. The strange thing, both of them came up from nowhere and followed two different paths. Gehrig coming up from the poor parentage, living up near the Polo Grounds in the Yankee Stadium most of his life, and never having seen a big league ball game, despite the fact that he lived so close to those big league parks, for the reason that they never had enough money to get into the parks. They didn't have knothole days back in Gehrig's day. And then Gehrig working his way up to the position that he attained in baseball. And then you think of Ruth coming out of St. Mary's Industrial School in Baltimore, which was more or less a school for wayward boys. Not that Ruth was wayward so much as that his parents were unable to take care of Babe, and Babe was allowed to shift for himself when he was just a youngster, and consequently the Baltimore authorities, to prevent Babe from becoming a charge of the city, placed him in St. Mary's Industrial School, and then on up through his life with Jack Dunn. and on up with the Baltimore Orioles to the Boston Red Sox, then over to the Yankees, in the years he played with the Yankees. And Ruth came to the big league practically ignorant of the ways of the world. He didn't know. I don't think when Ruth reached the big league, he could distinguish by right or wrong. Lots of times, man in his heart can distinguish between right or wrong. It's sort of a native instinct in a man to know the difference between right and wrong. But the pressure of glory upon Ruth overrode any instinct he might have had in that direction. Now, touching just back to that 1927 and 1928 Yankee club, listen, is this striking or is it not? I'll continue about Ruth in a moment and tell you a few things about the lighter side of his career. But nevertheless, just consider this. I often consider the 28 team of the Yanks as good as the 27 team. And here are the fellows who have died. Imagine this, from one team, a great team. Ruth, Gehrig, a catcher by the name of John Grabowski, Urban Shocker, a great pitcher, Herb Pennock, another great pitcher, Tony Lazzari, a great second baseman, Miller Huggins, a great manager, Gene Robertson, a substitute third baseman who disappeared. No, I don't know whether he's dead or not, but nobody ever heard from him. And the traveling secretary of the New York Yankees at that time, Mark Roth. All of those people who were intimately connected with the 27 team and the 28 team have passed on. And that if it was back around 1898 or 99 or something, or 1906, you might rather expect it. But after all, 28 years, 1928 is only 20 years ago, and to think that all those fellows have gone. So I played on those teams. Kind of scary, isn't it? But I first saw Babe Ruth when I joined the Boston Red Sox. That was back in 1919. Ruth, you know, in my estimation, was the one player in the history of baseball who could be admitted to the Hall of Fame on two counts. One as a pitcher and later as a home run hitter. Of course, he made his big reputation as a home run hitter. But nevertheless, he was a marvelous pitcher. He holds records in pitching, and I believe until Lefty Grove broke the left-handed pitching record, I think Ruth had the best winning percentage of any left-hander in the business. I'm not quite certain of that. I might be a few points off there, but I believe it was something like that until, it may be that Hubble broke it later on, too. But for a long while, Ruth held the left-handed pitching winning percentage record. And I first saw him. He was a combination pitcher and hitter. That was when Ed Barrow, who was managing the Red Sox in 1919, made that shift from Ruth to the outfield, and Ruth to the outfield, and Ruth sometimes as pitcher. When I arrived in Boston, he was playing left field more than he was pitching. He came in to fill in some pitching turns, but he stayed out there. I know I was just a kid, and those were the days before the lively ball, of course. And those were the days when a home run was a premium, not today when it's held so cheaply. And I remember one particular series, one of the first series that I ever saw Ruth play. And that was against the old Chicago White Sox, the team that turned crooked. But nevertheless, they were still trying to win the pennant. That was in 1919. And lefty Claude Williams, one of the fellows that turned crooked, was pitching for the Chicago White Sox. And despite the fact that Williams turned out sour, he nevertheless was a great left-hander. And the game was the first game of a doubleheader in Boston, and Ruth came up to the plate in the ninth inning and hit the ball over the left field fence. Now, to most baseball fans, that wouldn't mean as much to a baseball fan as it would to a baseball player. But don't forget that back in 1919, that just wasn't done. Left-handed batters knocking him over the left field fence. And he just didn't hit it over the left field fence. He hit it off a left-handed pitcher over the left field fence. And he was a left-handed batter, and the ball carried a tremendous distance. And even the White Sox, in between the games, all rushed into the clubhouse. They were trying to win the pennant, mind you. And they rushed into the clubhouse to congratulate Ruth on that particular sock, because even they had to admit it was a tremendous feat. And that was with more or less the dead ball. And that ball didn't go so far. There are plenty of stories. Now, here's another thing why Ruth is uncanny. This epitomizes, I believe, the entire life of Ruth. He had the knack of doing the most uncanny things at the most uncanny times. And even in death, if I may mitigate talk a little bit here. Even in death, the fellow had to be uncanny, did he not? Here 2 weeks ago, or is it 2 weeks ago, the Babe Ruth story opened in New York. The first night of the picture, the Babe Ruth story, July the 26th, it opened in New York City. The moving picture of Babe Ruth's life, or it's supposed to be. I understand the picture is only carries some incidents of his life, and more or less where he sympathizes with kids all through the picture, which he did too. That was part of his life, but not to the degree that the picture shows. But there he was, a sick man. He went down to see the opening of that picture in a theater in New York. And here was the big fellow, could hardly stand up. He had to be assisted into the theater. And you might say that was his last real physical exertion. He was taken home from seeing the picture of his own life, taken home and then taken to the hospital, and by George dies just when that picture is being released. Now, after seeing it. Now, that is the way that he did everything. I mean, it's strange, I know it, but if I was talking to you in your living room, as I said before, I would tell you that. It's a strange thing that you think that the big Babe had to die 2 weeks after the picture was made. Or not made, but released. And that's the way he always was. He was an uncanny. He'd appear before a large crowd on a Sunday, and he'd hit a couple of home runs and satisfy somebody on a Monday in Boston, when the Yankees would go to Boston, when the Red Sox were last in the league, and Monday there'd be 500 or 600 or 1,000 people out there. Maybe he'd strike out a few times. Wouldn't look so good, but put a big crowd out there, and he was Ruth again. He'd hit, and it came down into the clutch. And yes, he's failed in a pinch. I couldn't sit here and say that he came through. He used to lead the league in strikeouts. He used to strike out more than any batter in the league, and he could be struck out. George Yulee was one of the greatest pitchers ever pitched to him, but nevertheless, he can. If you must consider the overall pattern of his life. It wasn't that Ruth hit some longer home runs than Greenberg or Fox or Hornsby or Ralph Kiner or anybody that you care to mention. That isn't the deal at all. Ruth, I do think his longest home runs were longer than the longest home runs of other batters, but I also believe that other batters have hit lots of other home runs longer than lots that Ruth have hit. Don't forget, he hit 714 in his life, and lots of those were dunkers that just did get into the seats, the little cupcake home runs, those little things that fall in there. He hit quite a number of those, but by the same token, it was because Ruth could hit him so far and so often, and over the long period of years, which he did, that made him the home run hitter he was. And the stories about Ruth are simply wonderful. Like, for instance, back in 1928, I believe it was, the spring of 28, when he was holding out for more dough. And he held out for that $85,000 contract. Well, it so happened around that time, as I believe, there were some strikes, union strikes, or there was some unemployment somewhere. And Ruth was never the kind of a fellow that was conscious of anything that was taking place outside of his own realm. He didn't know much about politics, neither did he care. And he was down south this year, and you could see he was dying to play, but he wouldn't play because he was afraid that he might hurt a leg or something, and if he hurt a leg not under contract, then the club wasn't compelled to pay any expenses for the big guy. So while he was holding out, he wouldn't play. Well, finally he met a fellow named Bill Slocum, who was a newspaper writer from New York, a sports writer, and they were going out the side door of the Princess Martha Hotel in St. Petersburg, and Ruth and Slocum used to write articles under Ruth's name once in a while, and Ruth said, "Hey, come here, Bill." He says, "What do you think I better do about this contract? They're offering me $80,000, and he said, "I want $85,000. By George, Rupert's not going to get away with that." And Slocum didn't know what to say. That was putting Slocum on the spot. He didn't want to cast a deciding word in the contract of Ruth, so more or less kidding, he said to Ruth, "Well, you know, babe," he said, "a lot of people unemployed around the country." He says, "You know, a lot of people up there in New York are just begging for jobs, and there's bread lines a lot of places." He said, "By George, $80,000, quite a bunch of dough." Ruth says, "By George, I never thought of that." And he went upstairs. He called Rupert, went upstairs and signed his contract. But, well, I see we're a little late with station identification, and I'll just tell you that this is station WCPO, Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati's exclusive news and baseball station. Is that right? Now, a lot of people also believe that Ruth was just a hitter. That was not so. Ruth was a pretty good man on bases. He could run the bases, but naturally he didn't have to run the bases when he had pretty good hitters coming up behind him, because those fellows coming up behind him were the types of fellows that would hit the ball into the stands. So Ruth never did steal many bases, but when he wanted to, he was an excellent base runner. Well, he wanted to know, did Ruth have any hobbies? Well, yes, Ruth had, golf was his hobby, naturally. And surprisingly, for the big guy, he kept all his clippings. Now, in his home up there in Riverside Drive in New York, he has a little study fixed up, or a club room, and he has the prized pictures of his hanging on the walls, and these immense scrapbooks that he has saved all through his baseball career. And if you want to see something, you should see the letters from dignitaries and celebrities that he has, and pictures of these people hanging on that wall of his up there. And he was very much at home in his own way. Now, here's one of the inaccuracies I read in a story. That Ruth was a great man about town, great gadabout. Fellow went out a great deal. Was always here or there in the other place. Don't you ever believe it. I don't think that you ever heard of Ruth in a nightclub in his entire existence. Ruth used to partake once in a while of the flowing bowl. That's undeniable. That's plenty true. But on the road, for instance, when he had opportunities to go to nightclubs, he never went to a nightclub. Ruth stayed in his own suite of rooms in the hotel. And a very funny story, I think, about that. It's not so funny as it is odd. That, of course, the babe wasn't without ego. He always considered he was Ruth, and that was that. And he tried to act the part a great deal. Don't ever forget that Babe Ruth is one of the best-dressed men in the country. Yes, sir, boy. He was one of the best-dressed men in the country, and he knew how to dress, too. All except that cap he used to wear around, but he never would shed that. But if you ever saw Ruth in a straw hat, you'd never want to see him in the straw hat a second time. The cap was much more becoming. But nevertheless, he didn't go out on the road, and the Yankees, to satisfy the big guy, used to get him a suite of rooms, and that was for two purposes. That was because they always knew where he was. They always knew where he was because he'd always stay in the hotel, and he had a very red dressing gown and red Moroccan slippers, and he'd sit up there in his room after the game, up in his suite of rooms, and he'd entertain like the king, the Maharaja, and the door was always open. There were never any locked doors in the room, and I, for instance, like in the Book Cadillac Hotel in Detroit, with Babe holding court, why, it was nothing to see 200, 250 people pass through those rooms during a night, getting signatures, and Babe treating him to this and treating him to that. And the king was holding court, always. And he never went out in New York, any of those public places at all. He was never seen around those places. If he ever went to a place to take a little drink of beer or something, there was a place named Donahue's over in New Jersey. And Babe used to cross the river, in Donahue built a special room in that place for Babe to go. He'd go over in that room with his party of friends and his wife and perhaps a few other friends, and go over there, and that's where they'd have dinner. Over in Donahue's, in that room, when Ruth wasn't in it, was locked. Nobody ever went in it, and Donahue kept everybody out of it. Well, we just get on to these things about the Babe. But, Babe was really, I could tell you many funny story about the Babe. He used to get mixed up in language quite a lot. I never forget the time that down in, he had a big, I don't know whether it was a Cadillac or a Packard, I forget what kind of a car it was, but nevertheless, he pulled into a gas station down in Miami or Miami Beach, or it was someplace in Florida. I think it was Palm Beach. That's where it was. It was Palm Beach, and one of the 400 of Palm Beach happened to pull into the same gas station in a Rolls Royce, and while the attendant was filling up the gasoline tank of the Rolls Royce, he happened to drop a remark, as an attendant might be, that was Babe Ruth and that big red job next to the Rolls Royce, and of course curiosity got the better of the lorgnette in the next car, and so she leaned out of the car and said to Mr. Ruth, just to make conversation, she said, "Oh, Mr. Ruth," she said, "I admire your car so much," she said, "could you tell me, are those brakes, those four-wheel brakes, just the time of the new four-wheel brakes," she said, "are they hydraulic or are they mechanical?" Ruth looked around at her and says, "Madame," he says, "I haven't the slightest consumption." Oh, it reminds me of the time, too, back in 1933, right after right during the World Series of 1933, Washington played the New York Giants, if you recall, and the Giants beat Washington in the 1933 series. But Ruth went down there as sort of a sports writer. He was asked to cover the series, although he had somebody doing the writing for him. And Babe was invited around the White House to meet President Roosevelt. Roosevelt was serving his first year in office that year, 1933, and the president had always been a great baseball fan, and so Babe was invited around to meet President Roosevelt with a number of other newspaper men. So Babe went around to the White House, and he was ushered into President Roosevelt's presence, and President Roosevelt extended his hand in greeting and said, "Why, Babe Ruth, if I'm not glad to see you." He said, "How are you, Mr. Ruth?" And Ruth said, "Oh," he said, "I'm fine. Great, Pres." So the president said, "Well, perhaps you don't recall, Mr. Ruth." He said, "It was back in 1920. He says, when Governor Cox and I were running for office, and he said I was running on the ticket with Governor Cox, and I was running for vice president. And he said, I met you before in Binghamton. You probably don't recall that, in Binghamton, New York, Mr. Ruth." He said, "If you recall," he said, "our trains arrived simultaneously at the Binghamton station, and he said there was a crowd of some 6,000 to 8,000 people down at this station to greet us, and he said we alighted from the train, and Governor Cox and our secretaries proceeded to the hotel, and up in the hotel I happened to turn to Governor Cox, and I said, 'Governor,' I said, didn't you think that was wonderful down at the station, the way so many people, such a large turnout to greet us? Why, sure we're going to be quite popular in this town." And before Governor Cox could answer, Governor Cox's secretary turned around to Roosevelt and said, "Why, Mr. Roosevelt," he said, "I hate to tell you this," he said, "but he said, that crowd wasn't actually down there to meet you and Governor Cox. Babe Ruth is playing an exhibition game in town today. They were actually down there to see Babe Ruth." And then the President Roosevelt turned around to Babe and said, "Oh, Babe," he says, "can you imagine a thing like that?" Babe, what do you think his answer was? Turned to Roosevelt and said, "Ha, yeah, Pres," he says, "that happens all the time." Oh, he's had many a session with presidents and queens and different things, and I mean legitimate queens. But it's too bad to see the big fellow gone. Now, there was a misunderstanding too. The fellow was entirely uncanny in his predictions. You take back in 1926, the Yankees had finished bad seventh in 1925, and they weren't in. Well, Westbrook Pegler, riding down, and he was a sports writer in those days. He came down to visit the Yankee camp in the spring of '26 and said the Yankees were just a mob of individuals and they would be lucky to finish seventh in the American League that year. Well, we started up with the Brooklyn Dodgers. We were going to play the Brooklyn Dodgers on the way north that year, and we beat them about 5 straight ball games. We arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, and Dazzy Vance pitched against Herb Pennock, I believe it was, and Herb Pennock beat Dazzy Vance 3-2. So after the ball game, that was the 6th straight loss we had handed Brooklyn. After the ball game, going back to the hotel, Joe Dugan, Babe Ruth, myself, and Pennock were riding in a taxi cab, and Ruth was kind of guffawing around about the whole thing. He says, "Hey," he says, he says, "by George," he says, "if we can beat this club," meaning the Brooklyn club, the remainder of the games of this exhibition schedule, we'll win the pennant."